From the British perspective, the First World War is oftentimes viewed as an unnecessary, a pointless, and avoidable tragedy. A one that didn't have to happen had only cooler heads prevailed. Something that only ever resulted in the loss of millions, and the ruination of millions of British lives. Now, sure, the French and the Russians, they had no choice but really to go to war because they were continental powers. They were under attack by Germany, by Austria. The war was brought to them. They had, especially in the case of France, to defend themselves. The United Kingdom was defended by the English Channel, by the Navy. They were not a continental power. They did not have to go to war to defend themselves. Their going to war was absolutely a choice, and indeed, the British were the ones who declared war on Germany, not the other way around. And again, what did they achieve? What did they actually gain in the end, other than, well, a few imperial possessions, sure, but certainly nothing that was worth the loss of all those millions of lives. The war was a tragedy, an avoidable tragedy. This is oftentimes how the war is seen in popular culture, that ultimately it should not have been fought, and the only reasons why it was fought were bad ones. This is a narrative which I disagree with, extraordinarily so. Rather, the First World War was not a pointless conflict. It was not a senseless slaughter. It was not without its reasons, without its causes. It was not an unjust war. Not for the British, not for the French, not for their allies. Indeed, the most moral thing, I dare say, the most just thing, and not only that, but the most logical thing which the British people could have done in 1914 was send forward their ultimatum to the German nation and indeed declare war upon them. Now, in fairness, could the ultimatum that ultimately launched Britain into the war have been sent earlier, before Germany attacked Belgium? Yes, obviously it could have. Maybe that would have actually played a role. Perhaps they could have laid down the terms of their alliance with France much more firmly, and indeed given proper warnings to Germany. Hey, if you attack France, we will go in to aid them. If you attack through Belgium, we will go in to aid them. They could have done things better. Yes, absolutely. And indeed, is it possible that war could have been avoided? Maybe it could have been, had everything been a little bit different. Although, in fairness, given the powder keg that was Europe, I think we can say, ultimately, the war would have started eventually anyways. It just depends on the circumstances under which it does, but that's beside the point. Given the events that happened up to 1914, and up to the beginning of the war, I dare say that the British people truly had no other option but to go to war, and their decision to go to war was a purely moral one, and, well, there are other interests involved, of course, but it was a wholly, I should say, moral one. It was a good one. Really, had the British decided to not go to war in 1914, they would have damned themselves in more ways than one, many more ways than one. The First World War was not a pointless conflict, but a genuine crusade, in many ways, against Imperial Germany, against the Kaiserreich, and one which could not have been avoided. Not if the future of the British people, of the Empire, and indeed the honour of old England, if you want to get romantic about it, could ever hope to be preserved. Now allow me to explain myself here, because I understand it's very much going against the grain to suggest that the First World War was indeed a noble and good conflict, if also a one in which obviously an extraordinary number of tragedies did take place. But indeed, I think, much like the Second World War is oftentimes viewed as a moral, as a just war in fighting against the just unequivocal terror and evil of Nazi Germany, well, I think that the First World War deserves a bit more credit along those sorts of lines as well. Now, obviously, Imperial Germany, the Kaiserreich, was nowhere near the absolute evil that Nazi Germany was, but it was, when compared with other powers at the time, really quite nasty in their own right. Now, first things first, let's start off with Belgium. Because, of course, whenever we're talking about the British nation in the First World War, and particularly why they got into the conflict, you have to talk about Belgium, because that really is the entire reason for the British getting involved. At least it's the most immediate, the most direct reason for them getting involved. Belgium was, by treaty of the British and the Germans, they had signed on to this treaty earlier, a neutral country. The Germans had earlier promised that they would not engage Belgium in a potential war between great powers. Her neutrality was guaranteed by the nations of Europe. In 1914, the Germans realized that if they were going to have any hope of winning this two-front war, they had to knock France out right off the bat, and in order to do so, the best possible way was to move through Belgium. It makes sense why they did it. There is a logical reason for it. It wasn't just pure malice. There's a logical reason why they went through Belgium. But all the same, that does not, because it makes sense, that does not justify the action. It was highly illegal according to their own treaties, but the Germans derided these treaties as mere scraps of paper in the world of realpolitik, something that they can brush aside on an as-needed basis, and that's what they did. They attack Belgium, not really by surprise. A lot of people were expecting it, but people were hesitant to send soldiers in to reinforce Belgium because no one wanted to be seen as the first aggressor, that sort of thing. But the Germans, when they attack Belgium, violate that neutrality. Now, the initial plan was for the Germans to move through Belgium, and perhaps if they did just move through Belgium, just walk along the streets, ignore the soldiers, ignore the towns, ignore the civilians, all that sort of thing, if they had just used Belgium as a highway of sorts, well then perhaps things may have ended differently, because with the invasion of Belgium, the British suddenly had the casus belli, if you will. They had the justification, the legal, the technical, if you will, justification to enter into the conflict, because of course they had signed a treaty with Belgium. And of course, if at that point alone, when the German soldiers enter into Belgium and in that way become the first aggressors of this new global war, from that point, if the British violated their treaty with Belgium, if they betrayed the trust that they had with the Belgian nation and did not go to war in aid of them as they had continually promised to do so, well, imagine the situation that would leave the British Empire in. After the war, who is to say that any of their allies would ever trust them again? The French and the Belgians would both despise the British, on whom they relied, in part at least, for their protection. Are the British going to be able to go to Russia and start saying, hey, so we lost our allies over here, can you maybe, help us out with some treaties and whatnot? The Russians aren't going to agree, especially after the beating, the sufferings that they had experienced in the war. Could they go to the United States, to the rest of their empire even? Could they look to Canada or Australia or the Union of South Africa and say, well, but we're still good, right? We're still buddies. I mean, yeah, we betrayed the other ones, but they weren't part of the dominions. They weren't part of the empire. We're still fine, right? No. The amount of diplomatic damage that would be done to the British nation would be so extraordinary that it would continue to have ripple effects throughout the rest, really, of British history. To betray a trust that was so very solidly signed, so to say, would be a very, very bad move for them, again, diplomatically speaking. The only ones, really, that I think they'd be able to get along with at that point would be the Kaiser Reich, and the Kaiser Reich had already shown themselves to be rather hostile to the concept of pieces of paper, scraps of paper, withholding the actions of nation-states and empire builders. Not a very good idea. But of course, the diplomatic aspect is only a very small part of it, because even still, when the Germans went in through Belgium, British public opinion, and of course in a democratic nation such as the United Kingdom at this time, public opinion sways many things, not necessarily everything, but many things indeed. And without public support in going to war, the British would find themselves in a very difficult situation trying to fight. Even if, yes indeed, on an official level they had promised to aid Belgium, they may have actually found themselves hamstrung, not really able to go to war, if the population did not stand in support of that war. What is it that made the British population stand so extraordinarily strongly in support of that conflict? That would be the Rape of Belgium. Now hold on, Brandon, you may be saying. The Rape of Belgium is Allied propaganda! Sure, there were some things that happened, but it wasn't anywhere near so bad as the Allied propagandists made it out to be. You know, if the Entente powers hadn't been telling these fabricated stories of peasants being crucified along the roads, or of babies being quite literally consumed by German soldiers, well then, the war would not have happened, and indeed, the British public would have realized that they would have known better. Had they been better informed, they would not have been willing to send their boys off to war. They would not have lost those millions and millions of lives. Sure, the British may have gone to war anyways because of those diplomatic reasons, but at least less lives would have been lost. The British would have been more willing to sign earlier peace treaties. They would not have been so very intense, so to say, in those first actions. Arguments like that can be made. But of course, it doesn't really matter in the end that that the Allied propaganda, that the Entente propaganda was exaggerated, because it was still based, it was still grounded in reality. Did the German soldiers crucify farmers along the roads of Belgium? No, they didn't. But they did massacre them by the thousands. Did they really eat Belgian children? No, they did not. But they did still bayonet them and shoot them. The Rape of Belgium may have been exaggerated, but it still very much took place. The German nation was a highly militarized one, a one based largely in ideals of law, order, and discipline above all else. They, as a nation, believed in the concept of collective punishment. If you move into Belgium and a town is found guilty of having some partisan activity, of them having blown up a bridge or blocked a roadway, trying to defend themselves from a foreign invasion, imagine such a crazy concept as that, trying to fight to defend yourselves from a foreign occupying army of which you have no idea what they're going to do. Sure, they're saying that they're going to treat you well, but you have absolutely no genuine guarantee that the foreign army, which is invading you, is actually going to live up to those words. And now, yes, of course, they're saying that they give us their word that they're not going to harm us, but they also gave us their word, in I think the 1870s with the London Conference, that they wouldn't attack us to begin with. Scraps of paper are not exactly very important to the German Kaiserreich. Of course they're going to defend themselves, of course the Belgians do, and in reprisal for these acts of self-defense, the Germans begin exacting collective punishment on the German peoples. If a railroad is destroyed, a village may be leveled. If there are indeed rumors, if there is the idea that there may be Belgian free shooters, snipers, partisans, shooting away at German soldiers, well, they would gather entire villages and mow them down, massacring them with rifle fire, with machine guns, and with bayonets. Did they eat the children? No, but they murdered them. That is sufficient in so many ways for war. I have some statistics here, if I can put on my eyes, as far as how significant the Rape of Belgium truly was, and indeed of just how much the Belgian people suffered during the conflict. Now again, exaggerated, but I think this tells a rather interesting story that's certainly not fabricated entirely. In the Rape of Belgium, 6,000 Belgian civilians were killed directly by German soldiers. Not as a result of the occupation, but 6,000 people murdered by German soldiers. Perhaps, and this did happen multiple times, I believe this one in the village of Dinant, which was completely leveled, over 1,000 buildings burnt to the ground, and I think over 600 people killed, murdered in the town streets, including, of course, some people aged 90 years and older, and the youngest victim being about a month old. Why were all of these things, why were all these people massacred? Why were all these people murdered and these villages destroyed? Well, because there were rumors of free shooters. Likely it was German firing on the other side of the village. German soldiers murder a civilian across the way. The other Germans in the column here, those are gunshots, were being fired upon, and hell is unleashed upon the village of Dinant. But of course, the 6,000 Belgians who were murdered directly by German forces is really nothing in comparison to the 60,000 Belgians who were killed overall as a result of the German occupation. as a result of the destruction of land, the burning of villages, the expulsion of Belgian civilians, things like that. In addition to the 60,000 civilians who died as a result, a direct result of this German occupation, there were another 30,000 of them who were maimed, scarred, made invalid as a result of the conflict. Some of them on a temporary basis, some of them who would never recover. And of course, these statistics record physical acts, physical crimes, deaths, and physical maimings, if you will. It does not include, of course, the untold number, I'm sure there were a great deal, many of them, of victims whose wounds, shall we say, were more psychological than anything else. I'm speaking here, of course, of victims of sexual assault and other similar heinous activities. But of course, that's not all. You see, as if this alone did not strike enough of a resemblance, of a similarity to the German Third Reich, the Kaiserreich also interned about 120,000 Belgian civilians into forced labor camps. Half of these men were deported to Germany to serve in things like munitions factories and repairing and building new infrastructure. The other half of them were kept just behind the front lines, doing things like, again, repairing infrastructure, and in at least a few instances, being on the front lines to dig trenches and reserve trenches and lines of communication, things like that. Being quite literally forced on the front line where our Allied artillery was falling all around them. 120,000 people sent into forced labor by the Kaiserreich. These are activities which we so commonly associate the Third Reich with, that sometimes we forget the Second Reich did them at all, that we forget that the Kaiserreich was also, by its own merits, in its own standards, not a very nice nation. 1.5 million Belgian refugees were displaced as a result of the invasion of Belgium, of the destruction of villages, the roving and ravaging, if you will, of the armies. And, well, now on one hand you may think to yourself that the Germans would not necessarily be okay with these refugees, but that they may not want them necessarily in Belgium itself. After all, they are proving a difficulty. Refugees, you have to feed refugees. You have to worry about partisanal activity among the refugees. Things like that. You know, these are people who are very hostile to your reign, and now they are displaced, they are homeless, they have nothing to lose. 1.5 million of these people roving around the countryside. Well, you may think to yourself, well, something has to be done about them. Second World War Germany, of course, would probably just start putting them into camps. But Kaiserreich Germany is not really at that level. They're not that bad. But all the same, the things that they did to them were not exactly kind. You see, Germany in the, again, First World War Germany. It doesn't sound like First World War Germany from how they're usually portrayed. In order to prevent these 1.5 million Belgian refugees from escaping the German occupation, and yes, in fairness, many of them may well have taken arms up against the German Reich, so it's understandable that they want to keep tabs on them in a way, I suppose. In order to prevent these men from escaping, well, these refugees, some of them were men, some were children, some were women, all those sorts of things. In order to prevent them from escaping, the Germans established what they referred to as the Todesdraht, what the Dutch referred to as the Dodendraad. In English, the death wire, or the wire of death. It was an electric fence built all along the border with the Netherlands, designed again to prevent anyone from crossing over. I think a couple hundred volts were sent through the thing. I forgot the exact number, but I can list it down below here. A number of hundreds of volts sent coursing through that wire to, of course, immediately kill anyone who dared trying to cross over it. And, of course, the Belgians did try to employ a number of different means to get over that wire, oftentimes unsuccessfully. And in fact, as well, in order to prevent those civilians from attempting to get over the wire through whatever means they could derive, German soldiers who were patrolling these fences did indeed have direct orders to fire upon and summarily execute anyone caught within, it was, between 100 and 500 meters of the wire who could not immediately justify their presence there. About 3,000 people, 3,000 Belgian civilians, would be killed as a result of this electric fence preventing people from leaving. Symbolism, again, strikingly similar to, much later, concentration camps. All of Belgium wired in. Did the Rape of Belgium take place the way that the Allied propaganda said that it did? No, it did not. It was exaggerated. It was made to be larger than life, to really make the Germans out to be the true Hunnic enemy that had to be quashed no matter what, because they were going to be the destroyers of civilization itself. Now, is that the case? No, of course that's not the case. But that does not suddenly mean that the Second Reich, that the Kaiser Reich, that the German Empire was a very good power. It does not mean that they were behaving themselves in Belgium. You know, just because the Nazis are oftentimes portrayed in our video games and in our films as mustache-twirling, you know, absolute pure evil comic book style villains without any at all redeeming qualities, just because that's a little bit much of an exaggeration, that there were indeed men, people who were simply deeply flawed within the Nazi ranks, it does not suddenly mean that Nazi Germany is forgiven of its crimes. In the same exact way, the Kaiser Reich cannot be forgiven its crimes just because these same crimes were later on, indeed contemporarily, exaggerated in other ways. The Rape of Belgium happened. It happened very, very, very much so. And it was that Rape of Belgium, that really drove those British peoples to support the war with Germany. Had it not happened, the British probably would not have been so very keen on the war, but indeed this Allied propaganda, which is again seated in reality, very much whipped up the British people into this moralistic frenzy that they had to go to war. What are they going to do? After the British people had promised Belgium that they would defend them, that they would support them in exactly this sort of circumstance, not only are they going to break that promise, but are they going to be looking at the atrocities that the Germans are visiting upon these Belgian people, and are they then going to say, nah, it's not worth it? The problems we were talking about earlier of diplomacy, of the position that would put the British nation in future, could be even worse than if the Germans had just walked through the region. There was no way for the British to betray that trust and come out on the end of it looking like anything close to a good guy. And of course, public perception, again, in this time period, matters massively. Even the British public themselves, the British people wanted that war. They all very much were very keen on making it happen, so to say. It's logical, alongside necessary, that they did, in fact, go to war. It was not a matter of the British people being forced into it by any sort of, imperial elite or something like that. Sorry, that's a long rant, I know, but you've come to be used to those sorts of things, I think, by this point in this channel. That is not, of course, the only reason for the British to go to war. That's the moral reason, if you will, the moral justification for the German Empire being stopped. Let's also look, if we will, at the practical considerations, as far as the actual realpolitik is concerned. What would have happened had the British nation not entered into the conflict? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that the German Empire could have won the war without the British getting involved. I mean, I think it's actually not that, it's not that unfair to say that that the Germans could well have won the war without the British getting involved, because, of course, the French Empire would have lost massively in terms of materials, in terms of manpower, in terms of support, in terms of their entire left flank being largely reliant on British support to actually hold that line. So let's say, indeed, that the Germans, as a result of, say, the British not entering into the war, are able to defeat the French nation. Now, they're not going to do the same thing that they did to Belgium, to France, obviously, because they aren't fighting a war there. They're not interested. They're not, as the Nazis were, ideologically driven to visit these atrocities on the civilian populations. Merely, they were doing so as what they viewed as a practical attempt to subjugate the population. It didn't work in Belgium, of course. Collective punishment never really works, historically speaking, not in the modern time periods, at least. But But at least, the Germans were thinking practically in how they did it, not so much ideologically hate-driven as the later Third Reich was. So France would not necessarily have suffered in those ways under the German Reich. But if the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is anything to go by, and how the Germans treated the Russian nation after their own defeat in the conflict, how they removed, I think, 25% of the nation's industrial capacity, how they took 75% of its resources, how they basically gutted the population of the Russian Empire, reducing its power significantly. Basically, they made Russia into a third-rate power as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, they did not annex any Russian territory, but they, they made tributary states, they made protectorate states, they made buffer states all along the border, many of which the idea was at least to put them underneath German princelings, so they would, again, have that allegiance to the German Empire. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, maybe that could be a whole other separate video in and of itself, but to put it rather simply, destroyed the Russian nation so very completely, so much so that it really shocked the world. In fact, a lot of people in the Treaty of Versailles were saying, not only they were saying that it wasn't too harsh, they were saying it wasn't harsh enough because of what the Germans did to the Russians at Brest-Litovsk. If we can say, potentially, that there's no real reason, I don't think, why not, the Germans could well have done the same thing, something very similar at least, to the French people. Had the Germans defeated France in the First World War, look at the position, again, that the British would be put in. They themselves would still have their strong navy, and they would not have lost those millions of lives, absolutely. But there's always going to be another war. You cannot believe that we have achieved peace in our time, truly ever. It's always, historically speaking at least, the idea of there's not going to be any more war has quite literally never been the case. It's never been the case. When the next war comes, this is a time period as well, of course, in which most people are always planning ahead for the next war. That's why they weakened Germany at Versailles in an attempt to lessen the effect of the next war, or make sure that the next war would not be Germany doing all these terrible things to the rest of Europe. Well, in that next war, Germany would control more or less the entirety of the East, because Russia would be no longer a factor. Not that they were too much ultimately a factor in the First World War, because they did not do very well. But Russia would be completely non-factor, so Germany, because it has all those buffer states, would not even have to worry initially about fighting a two-front war, which is, of course, the main thing that was holding them back in the First World War, the idea of it being a two-front. That's why they had to strike. That's why they were in such a precarious position. France as well may well have been devastated. They may well have lost colonial possessions. They may well have lost industrial capacity. They may have lost population. They may have lost military capacity. They would have been weakened, possibly even destroyed if they were carved up in the same way that Eastern Europe was. They could well as well have been a non-factor. And the next time, if you have suddenly a position where you have the British Empire and then a continent effectively under German dominion, domination, German hegemony, the English Channel looks thinner and thinner every single day. Look at the position that Britain was in the Second World War. The Channel protected them, yes, but would not have done so forever. That was a very precarious situation that the British nation found themselves in. They were very, very close, at least it was thought at the time they were very close, to facing the threat of invasion. Ultimately, would Nazi Germany have ever stood a chance of really winning the war? I don't think so. But the idea being that the Second World War was awful, absolutely awful for the British nation, in that they were being bombed and all these different things. And if they were to allow in the First World War the Germans to achieve in a more solid and long-term basis, without continual conflict, that sort of hegemony over the conflict, the next war would have looked exactly like the Second World War, only with the Germans immediately having all of those benefits. Before the First World War even broke out, Germany was the most populous nation in Europe. They had the largest and strongest army by far. They had a navy which was beginning to rival the Royal Navy. Their industrial capacity was the strongest of any nation in Europe. As soon as the German Empire united in the 1870s, they were a titanic powerhouse of an empire, of a nation. You know, overnight, the British Empire and the French empires have a third rival, which in fact is greater than them in terms of economic output and population growth rate and whatnot. That's horrifying. And if all of those natural advantages which the Germans had at their foundation were to be multiplied even further by getting rid of, as a threat, the Russians and the French to either side of them, and the British were all of a sudden themselves with no allies because they betrayed their allies by not going to war, they alone facing off against this juggernaut of a German military, they would not have stood a chance. What are they going to do? Sign a treaty with Germany? Again, we see how that ended in the past. The British Empire would effectively be ended in terms of its global control. It would only exist at that point by the grace of the German Empire, which could at will basically destroy the thing unless the British stopped them there in 1914. Not only is this the perception, not only is this the idea, but it is very much the reality of the thing as well. Again, look at Brest-Litovsk. Convinced that the Germans would have tried something further, something similar to that in the West against France, and in that sort of situation, it would not be very good for the British. The only allies that the British would have would probably be the Americans, who are also, of course, extraordinarily interested in their splendid little isolationism. Right, so this was a rather ranty video, I understand, but it genuinely bothers me, is the thing, that there are so many people out there who are always going on about how, well, really there were no bad guys in the First World War, or really the war was pointless, really Britain shouldn't have gotten involved, people saying that Britain's getting involved was a waste, it was pointless, that indeed some people even deign to say that the British actively made the wrong move by siding with France in the First World War, which just boggles the mind, again, given what the Germans were doing in the conflict. Rather than the war being pointless, I do believe it was moral, it was necessary, and it was, of course, logical why the British fought it. It became, yes, a tragedy that so many lives were so completely destroyed as a result of the war. And the British Empire, the British people, suffered massively as a result of that. But that suffering was not without purpose. It was not without cause. We cannot look at the First World War and say that it was useless, unlike the Second World War, which at least had a moral point to it. The First World War absolutely had a purpose, and that was the defense of the free peoples of Britain, of France, of Belgium, later on of even the United States, it might be argued, of indeed the Russians, although the Russians weren't really free. They were quite terrible in their own right, but that's a whole other subject for another day. Indeed, the First World War was not pointless. And as well, I understand that, given that this was sort of a ranty video, that I may have slipped up at a few points in this. I may have said a few things that later on I'm thinking, no, I need to qualify that more. And so if there are going to be any corrections in this video that are not popping up around me during the video, please do look at the description down below, where you can find any sorts of updates that I may need to make for the video. Thank you, as always, to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on patreon.com. It is, again, by virtue of your support that I am able to carry on with the work that I do, making videos like this one, and perhaps, as well, those videos which will be a little less controversial. And, of course, to you as well, my dear viewer, thank you so very much for watching, and, of course, until the next time, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.